Hi, everyone, and welcome back to a Criminally Basic podcast. I'm Megan,
And I'm Hannah.
and this week we're diving into a subject that has both fascinated and terrified me for a while. I mean, to be real, the majority of true crime content fascinates and terrifies me, but there's something about the subject of today's episode that just really makes me uncomfortable, I think is the best way to describe it. Most of the people that we talk about on this show, and I feel most of the people who commit heinous acts against others in general, are adults. But today's subject was just 13 years old when he committed a terrible act against his great grandmother and was sentenced to life in prison. In this episode, we'll be diving into the life of Antonio Barbeau and learn what led him to take a life. Before we discuss the crime and the perpetrators, I think it's important to kind of set the scene. The events we'll be talking about today took place in 2012, but according to the Sheboygan Falls Police Department website, the last homicide in Sheboygan Falls, Wisconsin, prior to September 2012, was in 1996, which is why the murder of a 78-year-old woman was shocking to the residents of this quaint, quiet, and safe town.
It's always those towns that surprise you with the murders.
Absolutely. Antonio and his friend, Nathan Pape, weren't even in high school yet. The two boys were best friends, and while I couldn't find out much about when they met and their history together, I can imagine they knew each other for at least a few years. Antonio, in particular, was a little bit of a troublemaker. I found in numerous sources that he had been sentenced to serve time in a non-secure juvenile detention facility. Now, I hadn't heard of non-secure juvenile detention. I had just kind of assumed that,
Me either.
right? You just kind of assume that all juvie facilities are locked, like basically kid prison with an emphasis on education and rehabilitation. Which, side note, I think is how all prisons should be, emphasis on education and rehabilitation, but that's an entirely separate conversation for another day. According to the U.S. Office of Justice Programs, quote, NSD attempts to fill the gap between traditional locked facilities and voluntary shelter care, end quote. I've also seen them described as, quote, staff secure, end quote. Basically, it's not like the doors are locked all the time and, like the kids can't get out, but it still offers the same educational programs and other efforts of a traditional juvenile center. So it's kind of an in-between.
Oh, okay. But I mean, still, neither sounds great,
Right.
honestly.
Yeah, not a place you want to end up. I couldn't find exactly what Antonio was in for. I imagine that since he was a minor and he wasn't tried as an adult in this circumstance, that those records are sealed. But I did find that the majority of kids who are sent to these facilities have some sort of behavioral issue. Since he was sentenced to a non-secure center, I can imagine that his offense wasn't terrible, but his behavior had most likely been declining, and that there was kind of a final straw in there somewhere that got him sent to that facility in the first place. So somehow, Antonio got out of the facility.
Well, it seems very easy to get out, if I'm being honest.
I agree. Some sources I found said that he simply walked out because it wasn't a locked facility and he could technically leave. But some sources do use the word escaped, and I'm not quite sure who to believe. Facilities vary from state to state and from facility to facility, so I can't really know for sure. But no matter the circumstances, he did get out and he needed a place to stay. So he stayed with fellow 13-year-old Nathan. Nathan's parents didn't seem to have a problem with this. And when I read that he had stayed with this kid, I mean, this kid is clearly living with people. He's 13. And so I searched for anything that mentioned, why would his parents let Antonio stay with them? Did they know that Antonio had been sent to this facility in the first place and was not supposed to be out in the general public? But I couldn't find anything. I really want to know why they were okay with this kid staying with them. Maybe they didn't know. Teenagers can be sneaky. Maybe they didn't know that there was this other kid in their home.
I mean, that's very possible. Also, they could feel bad for him. They could have lied and told him something totally different than what happened.
Absolutely. There's really no way of knowing. I searched and searched, could not find it. But either way, Regardless, he stayed with Nathan for a few days to avoid going home and then inevitably going back to the juvenile facility. This brings us to September 16th, 2012, which is the day before the murder. Antonio and Nathan started plotting, a plot to steal money from his great-grandmother, who they believed to be rich. Quote, "We were going to try to scare her to get money and then use force if needed," end quote. The prosecutor, after he said this, would then ask what he meant by attack. After some stuttering, Antonio relented, saying that he would kill her if necessary. That's what he meant by attack. The next day, Nathan's mother dropped them off close to Barbara Olson's home, unaware that she was delivering them to the location where they would end a life, and, I guess in a way, end their lives as well. They hid in the garage, according to reporting for WISN 12 News, and had entered through the unlocked garage door. Barbara didn't keep her garage door locked. She didn't feel the need to, especially in such a safe suburban town. However, once Barbara got home and she noticed the boys, she invited them in. Since Antonio was on the run from his parents, Barbara said that she was going to call them. But then she turned her back, and the two boys looked at each other and nodded. Antonio pulled out a hatchet, and Nathan pulled out a hammer, and the two boys proceeded to beat and hack her to death with 27 total wounds.
Oh my God, that's horrific. That's disgusting, and also such a brutal way to go.
Absolutely. They did attack her from behind first, but the, autopsy and examination by the coroner would later show that she didn't pass out from just the initial blow. Based on the wounds on her hands and on her arms, we know that Barbara tried to fight. But at the end of the day, she was in her 70s, in her mid to late 70s. There wasn't much that she could do.
Still, some teenage boys are strong.
Absolutely. And I mean, these are two teenage kids who are coming after you with the intent to kill you. I don't know how tall they were at the time, but at a certain point, if they have weapons and you don't, that doesn't necessarily matter.
Very true.
After she was dead, the boys tried to haul her body into the back of her vehicle. But when they couldn't, they ended up leaving her at home and stealing her vehicle, her purse, some jewelry, and less than $200 from her home.
It always bothers me when people kill for money, and then the money they kill for is very little.
According to court documents, the boys had come prepared. They wiped down portions of the home with cleaning supplies they had purchased, and the next day they wiped down the stolen vehicle. They bought pizza and marijuana and used the stolen vehicle as transportation. However, the police soon found the car, which still had the murder weapons inside of it. They hadn't gotten rid of those.
Oh my God, they idiots.
They are dumb in multiple ways. Both boys were apprehended within 12 hours of the murder. Initially, both of them denied their involvement. In one of the boys' school lockers, they found the bloody clothes and some of the missing jewelry. In January, according to an article by Emily Thompson of Morbidology, Antonio entered a plea of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. His lawyer would try to argue that he didn't understand the severity of his crime. And the reason that he cited for this was because he lied to police when he was first arrested. When he was first arrested, he said that he had nothing to do with it and that he didn't know what happened, but then would later relent and say that he did know what happened. So for some reason, his lawyer thought that this was a way to get him out of something. Eventually, though, he would later change his plea to no contest, and this was part of a plea deal which would allow for him to become eligible for parole in 35 years. Due to this, he was convicted of first-degree intentional homicide and sentenced to 35 years to life.
Well, at least he's in jail. Like, it's sad he's so young and having to stay a good portion of his life in jail, but still, he shouldn't have killed someone.
And they did choose to try them both as adults. They weren't going through juvenile court for this. They came to the decision that they knew right from wrong, and that with a crime this severe, even if you're 13, you know that that's incorrect. Antonio's co-criminal, Nathan, would also plead not guilty. and his case would actually end up going to trial. Antonio would testify at that trial that they both had equal involvement. Nathan's lawyers and his family were trying to say that Antonio was the mastermind and that Nathan had just gone along in order to not be hurt, that Antonio had threatened him, said, "You have to be a part of this." And Nathan was nothing more than an innocent bystander who, yeah, maybe hit Barbara a few times, but he only did so in order to avoid being hurt by Antonio.
But still, though, he was there and witnessed it and didn't stop it.
I'm coming back to this coroner's examination of Barbara's body. There was sufficient evidence to support the case that he had hit Barbara just as many times as Antonio had, because the wounds between a hatchet, even the blunt side of a hatchet, and a hammer are going to be different. And
oh, yeah, absolutely. They're very different.
Absolutely. So based on everything that they saw, they said, no, that's not what happened. That's not physically what could have happened. Therefore, Nathan was found guilty of being party to first-degree intentional murder, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 31 years. Both boys will be 50 years old by the time they have a chance for parole.
You wasted a majority of your life because of $200.
It baffles my mind, and this is kind of where we get into, I think what really freaks me out about this case is children committing crimes. There's just something about that makes me
it's
really
horrifying.
Right? I shudder to think of what it must feel like to have your child or your grandchild or great-grandchild commit a crime against you, that, someone who you have loved from the very beginning of their life turn into a monster. I guess we could say maybe fortunately they were dumb enough in order to be caught, because
fortunately, unfortunately.
Right. It's tragic that this case even happened in the first place. I think
that's true.
It's horrible and horrifying and all of the adjectives that I could use to say how awful it was. But they were caught and they were stopped. I shudder to think of what could have continued, seeing that they only planned the murder the day before. This wasn't months and months of planning. This was the day before, hey, let's murder this woman. And then the next day they did it. Thank you all for listening to A Criminally Basic Podcast. If you'd like to learn more, check us out at A Criminally Basic Podcast on Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter.
And check out our sources as well as our photos on our website, www.acriminallybasicpodcast.podbean.com.
Thanks for listening.